hopefully that'll be fine. Okay, so today I'm going to come at the subject from an art historian's point of view and do a short paper based on some research that I've been involved with through the network on women's histories in the history of electricity and energy. And obviously, if anybody has any questions, please do bob them in the chat bar, and we can also address them at the coffee break afterwards. Okay, so in 1875, Agnes and Rhoda Garrett set up A&R House Decorators from their home at 2 Garrett Street, Bloomsbury, later described as, I quote, an independent firm with extensive business. The Garretts were starting out in their profession as decorators at a time when women were only just taking over as the main decision makers and consumers of interior decoration in the home, a role that was starting to be seen as a woman's right and duty. As one of their key methods of persuasion, the following year they published Suggestions for House Decoration, a book with the aim to provide woman to woman, a few practical hints for the home. One of the key considerations discussed was heating and lighting, which is why, of course, it's been of interest to me in terms of the history of electricity. So my paper today will consider the Garretts and Mrs. Mary Eliza Hawes, whose book, The Art of Decoration, published in 1881, contains one of the first references to lighting by electricity that I've found to date in a book by women. These women were described as lady experts, the professional advisors of the middle classes, and each had a clear political, cultural, aesthetic and social reason for their recommendations. By tracking their suggestions, I will explore how energy decisions in the home were framed as a moral, social and political act, and how the emergent professional role of the female decorator was part of a wider push for suffrage. As Rhoda Garrett, seen here, argued to the audience at the National Association for the Promotion of Social Science in 1876, I quote, "The woman's sphere and woman's mission is one of the most important problems of the present day. But here, at least in the decoration and beautifying of the house, no one will dispute their right to work." In this way, house decoration and energy decisions might be considered at this time as an agent of reform, both carrying with it a moral imperative and furthering a woman's cause, or the woman's cause. So when we looked at the written histories of energy decisions of the period, however, they are still very overwhelmingly focused on men. While men have held pride of place in the histories of designing, inventing, financing, building, engineering and maintaining industrial energy systems, my work explores the less familiar role of women energy professionals in the late 19th and 20th century. There can be little question that, especially in the last 200 years, as centralised networks of fossil fuels and electricity have become to dominate energy systems, women's relationships to energy have been different at times to men's. One of the key ambitions of the work that I'm doing as part of an international network of scholars from a wide range of disciplines, including some of my colleagues today, and of course Graham Goody, who we've already heard from this morning, is to think carefully about women's influence, particularly in their roles in the home, both as householders and consumers and as professional advisors, in the history of the major energy transition to gas and electricity in the late 19th century, in order to ask the key question, what can we learn in terms of their potential in the future? In order to try and address the ambivalent status of these first professional women, as they both commercialised their role as professional advisors on decoration in the home, while promoting universal suffrage for women, I use the concept of mediation, which a number of scholars have cited when studying technological artefacts from social and historical perspectives. In this, I want to address the apparent contradiction between the success of their publications and businesses that relied on women feeling the need to seek guidance, and their demands for women to have a voice, power, and social influence in society as a whole. So in 1877, cousins Agnes and Rhoda Garrett published Suggestions for House Decoration, in which they spoke directly to the ladies of the family who have their taste consulted when furniture and decorations of the house are chosen. Clive Edwards has proposed that the Garretts, creators of the first all-female design and decorating company in Britain, use their experience to attempt to subvert the patriarchy of the household. Likewise, I've considered in recent writing the case study of Mrs. Hawes' The Art of Decoration of 1881, which includes one of the earliest print recommendations for the use of electricity in the home, and who uses her guide to the art of home as a space in which to urge her women readers to exercise their own rights. As she says, the province of a decorator is not to take your house out of your jurisdiction. His province is to help you in that mechanical part which you cannot do yourself. He may guide you, he must not subjugate you. Ironically, she does this in a book that is precisely aimed at telling the housewife what to do in her home. Women are exhorted to liberate themselves, but as we can see, their new role as both consumers and professional decorators raise a number of paradoxes in terms of agency and emancipation. There is an ambivalence at the heart of my chosen case studies of advice givers, and they're two different and opposing messages. On the one hand, as professional decorators and guides, they were preying on the insecurities, fear and ignorance of women consumers in making their own decorating decisions in the 1870s and 80s, when the transition to gas and electricity became a possibility, by giving them expert advice. On the other hand, they were also explicitly claiming that such decision-making empowered their women clients. While their guidebooks exhorted a woman to see home decoration as an enfranchising activity, aligning this work with the politics of suffrage, they also utilised a woman's need for guidance as a way of opening up a client base and building their business. As such, the first women decorators walked a very fine line between a deficit model of advice, embodied by the salesman's age-old pitch of "you need me because you cannot do this yourself," and positively encouraging women to find their own style as part of their wider opportunity to break away from patriarchal traditions. The work of the Garretts certainly provides evidence that they believed that female empowerment was an important component of what they were selling with their services. The Garretts were starting out in the profession as decorators at a point in time when women were only just taking over as the main purchaser for the home. Hence, those wishing to sell different forms of energy use into their homes needed to start to address them directly, including the authors of advice guides such as the Garretts, Mrs. Hawes's, Mrs. Orrin Smith's The Drawing Room, Its Decorations and Furniture of 1878, Mrs. Panton's Suburban Residences and How to Circumvent Them of 1896, and a book we've already encountered this morning, Mrs. Gordon's Domestic Electricity of 1891, that I'm considering as part of a larger project to understand the role of women and books on decorating the home and energy transitions. The Garretts and Mrs. Hawes, on whom I here concentrate, were pioneers as women decorators finding their way in what had been traditionally viewed as a man's world. When Suggestions was published in 1877, gas was still the norm, and so it's not surprising that this is the type of energy we see used by the Garretts in their illustrations and their home, and they chose to employ gas even into the 1890s. This is evidenced by an interview for Women's Pennies paper held in their home and business premises in Gower Street in 1888. And this quote comes from the Penny paper. So they said, "The bureau was cunningly ensconced in a corner by the fireplace." This is what you see here. Beside which projected a gas bracket holding a couple of opal-coloured globes, though the rest of the room appeared to be lighted by candles. And in other pieces of work, I've considered the fact that you get multiple lighting forms in the same space. So the fact that they chose gas may have been influenced by the fact that Newsom Garrett, Agnes's father and Rhoda's uncle, formed the Aldeburgh Gaslight Company in 1856, and shares in the company were held by a large number of family members. When Agnes won the tender to decorate her cousin Elizabeth Garrett Anderson's new hospital for women in 1892, each bed had its own light. There was a discussion during construction about the method of illumination for the hospital. The cost of fitting gas and electricity was roughly the same, but running costs for electricity were greater. Minutes record that Mrs. Anderson was getting some private interest to bear on the Midland Railway Company to see if they could supply the hospital, with an ambition that they'd bring the electricity in from St. Pancras. It is likely that she approached James Beale of Standon, and Standon, as some of you will know, is a house that I've considered very much in work elsewhere, as it was one of the first country houses to be built lit by electricity. But in the hospital, I think that the approach was made to James Beale because, as I said, they were going to try and tap into the supply generated to run St. Pancras Station. But this plan came to nothing, and the hospital was lit by gas in the end, even though it was wired for electricity. Ironically, the use of gas made it necessary, as we know, to regularly clean and paint the wards each summer. And in 1892, this contract was awarded to Agnes. In 1896, she was commissioned to undertake the cleaning and repainting of the interiors, and therefore she benefited directly from the use of dirty gas in terms of her future employment. As I've said, it's been argued very convincingly that the illustrations and suggestions that we see here were taken from real life, and our views of the Garrett's own home and rooms at number 2 Gower Street. So we can see here the old-fashioned bureau, the gas globes, and the rugs as described in the woman's penny paper. And this picture includes furniture known to have been designed by the Garretts. The Garretts took on a showroom warehouse in March 1879 at 4 Morwell Street in London, and it was used as a setting for at least one exhibition reported in Women in June 1887. The exhibition demonstrated a whole room setting, as was becoming the norm for the display of the interior furnishing by the 1870s, encouraged by their use of period rooms in the South Kensington Museum, later the V&A. And this allowed the Garretts to show their lighting designs alongside their designs for furniture, wallpaper and textiles. And I quote, "On 4 successive afternoons last week, numbers of visitors availed themselves of an invitation to see this veritable model of what a sitting room should be. Some brass sconces were hung on the walls, most of them designed by Miss Garrett, and all exquisitely worked in brass and copper by a real artist worker." This is one of the key pieces of scant evidence that we have, alongside the illustrations for suggestions of their designs for metalwork and lighting, especially as very few objects that were designed by them survive. In their first chapter of suggestions, the Garretts describe houses as they are, characterising a London home as full of machine-made objects decorated to disguise their form, materiality and function. This is followed by houses as they might be, where the Garretts describe the same London house treated according to their arts and crafts principles. These principles were illustrated in their designs for the 1888 iteration of the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society and their exhibition of a room decorated and furnished by R&A Garrett at the 1885 exhibition of Women's Industries in Bristol. Here they designed a complete interior consisting of metalwork, including lighting, furniture, carpets, wallpaper and woodwork. And such exhibitions demonstrated the movement's new attitude to home decorating, and a shift away from previous designs critiqued as dishonest for disguising the products and processes of manufacture. Objects that celebrated craftsmanship, materiality and function were seen as conforming to Christian values and providing good moral influence in domestic life. And in their guidance to light in the home, we can see the Garretts applying these arts and crafts principles. So in the discussion of the dining room in their ideal London home, we find a chandelier. They say so many really well-designed gas and candle pendants can now be wrought in polished brass and in forms consonant with lines and curves that metal may legitimately take. There is no excuse for the cast gasoliers coloured to imitate bronze that are found suspended over too many dining room tables. One of the great snares of metal workers of the present day is their aptitude to reproduce ecclesiastical forms in domestic work. For ornaments which would be appropriate enough in a church are quite out of place when used to adorn articles of domestic use. So beautiful lighting for the Garretts had to celebrate the very materiality of its construction and the function and skill of the craftsperson. In their chapter on the drawing room, the Garretts advised that when it comes to gas and candle brackets, door furniture and bell levers, etc., nothing better than polished brass can be used in their manufacture of these articles, with a focus on simplicity of form and delicacy of workmanship. They're focused in their design advice on an old rule worth remembering, which says ornament in the use of natural form should be such as it is not inconsistent with nature modelled by art. So their guidance as the aesthetics of light is directly linked to a wider concern for the philosophy of truth, honesty and morality. But as we say, the Garretts were, despite electricity being available, designing for gas. So in looking for electricity, we must turn to Mrs. Hawes. An arts and crafts stance to the aesthetics of lighting was also adopted by Mrs. Hawes in her advice guide. Whereas the Garretts writing in 1870s could only envisage gas, oil and candlelight, in chapter 8 of The Art of Decoration, Mrs. Hawes turns to the challenge of lighting and ventilation. And as I said, produces one of the earliest examples of women advising women on electric lighting in England that I've come across to date. Given the date of this publication in 1881, at the very earliest period of electrification, only 1 year after William Armstrong had first lit up Bragside using Joseph Swan's light bulbs, it's unsurprising that Hawes starts her chapter on lighting with the statement, "When the electric light comes into common use, the problem of how to light adequately a large room without heating it will be solved." Despite this pioneering opening statement, she then goes on to focus her discussion on gas. Although, like other female commentators, she points to the equally challenging issues with this form of lighting, saying that although it was the cheapest and least trouble, it was the most destructive to furniture and pictures, the least healthy and the least becoming. Mrs. Huwais, like many of the decorators and suppliers of lamp lighting at this time, considered the very oldest of lighting types as well as the newest, declaring that lamps are the next best if they can be induced not to smell, wax candles are best of all if they can be induced not to burn. She's focused throughout the book on the idea of natural and nature, and this is very much the case with lighting. She says the main light ought to be concentrated as much as possible in one spot. This is the nearest to a natural effect, for the sun is never in 2 or 3 places at once, and will be found becoming to the faces and folds of dresses. Here we can see that she's addressing her comments to women, and the concern for appearance under different lighting types is key to her work. She says it should be remembered that the faces look best, if we may venture to disagree with Queen Elizabeth, with their natural shadows, which give that drawing to them always missed on the stage when footlights glare up from below. Having discussed the right type of light, Mrs. Huwais goes on to think about lamp forms, and in this she echoes the arts and crafts advice of Garrett's. May I remind readers that a candlestick, she says, lamp or any other support ought to be a pretty and consistent object. By 1900, as you know, efficient lighting remained a luxury in England, and so Mrs. Huwais and her recommendations for electric lighting in 1881 were very much ahead of the times. She recognised that for women particularly, new lighting types would alter the appearance of the home, and those who spent most of their time in it, women of the house. And therefore they were the ones who were concerned not so much by the technologies, but by the aesthetics of change. And in the battle between the gas and electricity companies, they were key in terms of convincing the consumer as to which energy to source to comfort in the home. So energy supply, like home design, had traditionally been considered a decision for the master of the house, and the historiography of energy histories has tended to follow this path. In considering the pioneering case studies of the Garretts and Mrs. Huwais, I explore the critical question of ambivalence at the heart of their advice to middle-class women lighting up their homes. Rather than framing these professional guides as either being about denigration and control on the one hand or empowerment on the other, I want to use my case studies to suggest a new way of understanding how women worked with each other through times of energy transition and change. Rachel Plotnick, in her amazing article At the Interface, The Case of the Electric Push Button, explores the role of the electronic mediator, the actual push button that one would need to push to turn the lights on and off, from its invention in the 1880s until its wholesale adoption by the 1920s. Perhaps, therefore, the answer to the question of ambivalence is to see these women, the Garretts, Mrs. Huwais and others, through this lens of electrical mediation, not in terms of the actual technology, but in terms of those advising women on how to integrate it into their homes successfully. The term mediation, when used in human resources practice, for example, as I found out very much when I was head of school, aims to suggest a process of support and care. Can this interpretation offer us a way of understanding or framing the ambivalent nature of the first women professionals, guidance as care rather than as hard-faced consumer practice? Rather than seeing the home during the last major energy transition as a dialectical space for oppression or suffrage for women, what happens if we see the role of women advising women using ideas of respect, care, morality and mediation? How does this change the story? And what can we learn from this for the energy transition to a post-carbon future ahead of us? So lots to think about. But I want you to leave you with the description of Mrs. Huwais from one of her obituaries. It says, she was thought peculiar, and so she was. But she was a unique woman, brilliant, fascinating, with the intellect of half a dozen men controlled by a bodily machinery that thundered away within, and at which at last tore her to pieces. So in thinking about these amazing women in terms of the history of lighting, and particularly the history of electricity, I want to start a conversation to understand how understanding what professional decorators were saying and doing at this time can help us think about energy transitions within the home. Thanks.